At my niece's wedding in Orange County, I saw my name printed on the seating card, Linda Tran Manicurist, while everyone else had titles that sounded like careers engineer, broker, doctor, and my younger sister leaned close enough for only me to hear and whispered, "Maybe just say you run a beauty business tonight, it sounds better." I smiled. I always smiled when they said things like that. I picked up the card, turned it over like maybe there was another version of me printed on the back, but there was not. Just my name and the one word they had never been proud of, manicurist. I walked to my table. The ballroom lights were soft, the kind that made everything look more expensive than it really was, and I sat between people who talked about stocks and real estate and second homes in Palm Springs. Someone asked me what I did, and before I could answer, my sister said she works in beauty services, and she said it quickly like she was covering something fragile. I nodded. I did not correct her. I never did, but I remembered everything. I remembered the first day I held someone's hand in a nail salon in Garden Grove. My English was broken, my fingers were shaking, and I was afraid to even breathe too hard because I could not afford to lose that job. I was 22 when I came to America with one suitcase and a phone number written on a piece of paper. I cleaned motel rooms that smelled like bleach and old carpet. I washed dishes until my hands cracked. I learned how to smile at customers who never looked at me long enough to remember my face, and then one day someone told me you can learn nails in 3 months and make real money, real enough to send home, real enough to survive. I did not think about pride. I thought about rent. I thought about my mother back in Vietnam. I thought about staying in this country long enough to build something that no one could take from me. So I learned. I practiced on my own hands at night until the polish lines were straight and the shape was clean. I learned how to listen to people talk about their lives while I held their hands steady and quiet. I learned how to remember names, how to make people feel like they mattered even if I did not at the time. But at that wedding, none of that mattered. Not to them. To them, I was the one who painted nails, the one they did not know how to introduce without adjusting the truth. And as the music started and glasses clinked and laughter filled the room, I sat there with my hands folded on the table, the same hands that had worked 10 hours a day for years, the same hands that had built something small and steady and real. And I realized something very clearly in that moment. They were still ashamed of what I did. They just did not know what those hands had already built. I drove home from that wedding in silence. The freeway was almost empty, and the city lights blurred past me like something I no longer needed to chase. I kept my hands on the wheel, steady the same way I had trained them to be steady for years, because in my world one small mistake could ruin someone's entire set of nails and cost me a customer. I parked in front of my shop, a small place tucked between a laundromat and a sandwich store. The sign was simple: Linda Nails. The paint slightly faded at the edges, but clean. I always kept it clean. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and the smell of polish and acetone greeted me like something familiar, something honest. I turned on the lights one by one. 4 chairs, 4 stations, everything in its place. I stood there for a moment just looking at it, not the way my family would see it, not as something small or temporary, but as something built piece by piece, day after day, year after year. I remembered when I first signed the lease. I was 39 years old. I had saved for almost 15 years. Every tip, every extra shift, every holiday I worked while others stayed home. I counted every dollar at my kitchen table late at night, writing numbers on a notepad, making sure I could survive at least 6 months. If no one walked through that door, everyone told me it was a bad idea. My brother said, "You are not a business person." My sister said, "You are comfortable. Why risk everything?" Even my mother worried. She asked me if I was sure I wanted more stress in my life. I said yes, but the truth was I was already carrying it. I just wanted it to be mine. The first 3 months were quiet, too quiet. Some days no one came. I would sit in one of the chairs pretending I was busy organizing bottles, cleaning tools, wiping surfaces that were already clean. I watched people walk past the window and not come in, and I told myself, just wait, just keep going. I lowered my prices. I handed out flyers. I introduced myself to anyone who made eye contact. I learned to speak with more confidence even when I did not feel it. Slowly, 1 customer became 2, then 3, then regulars started coming back, not because I was the cheapest, but because I listened. I remembered their stories. I remembered their preferences. I remembered how they liked their nails shaped and what color made them smile. And over time, something changed. The shop was no longer empty. The chairs were no longer still. There was always someone waiting, always someone laughing, always someone trusting me with their hands. And tonight, as I stood there after that wedding, I ran my fingers lightly over one of the chairs, and I realized something else. They saw a title on a card, but they did not see this. They did not see the nights I stayed here until 10 o'clock cleaning. They did not see the mornings I opened at 9 without missing a day. They did not see the quiet discipline, the patience, the way I built this place without asking anyone for help. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to explain it to them anymore. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and looked back at the sign one more time. It was still small, it was still simple, but it was mine, and it was only the beginning. The next morning started like every other morning. I unlocked the door at 9, turned on the lights, and filled the small space with quiet before the first customer arrived. But something in me had shifted. I could feel it in the way I moved slower, not from tiredness, but from clarity. I no longer replayed my sister's voice in my head. I no longer wondered if I should say something different about what I did. I just worked, and that day the shop was full by 10, every chair taken, every technician focused, the sound of gentle conversation and soft music filling the air, and I stood behind my station greeting each client by name, asking about their week, remembering details that mattered to them, because that was what I had built, not just a place for nails, but a place where people felt seen. Around noon, a new customer walked in. She looked around carefully, like she was measuring the space against something she expected to find. She sat down across from me and said, "I heard about this place from a friend. She said you are always booked." I smiled and said, "I try my best." She watched me work for a few minutes, her eyes following every movement, every detail, and then she said, "You are very precise." I nodded. I learned that over time. She asked how long I had been doing this. I told her more than 20 years. She seemed surprised. She said, "You must really love it." I paused for a second, because no one in my family had ever asked me that question before, and I realized I did not love the job in the beginning. I loved what it allowed me to do. I loved the independence, the control, the ability to build something steady and real with my own hands, and somewhere along the way that became enough, and then it became something more. The afternoon passed quickly, appointments back to back, each one a small moment of connection, a quiet exchange of trust, and by closing time I looked at the schedule for the next week, every slot filled, every day planned out weeks in advance, and this was no longer the small uncertain place it had once been. After we finished cleaning, I sat at the front desk and opened my laptop. I reviewed the numbers like I did every month. Revenue, expenses, payroll, supplies, rent, everything written clearly in front of me, and I did not rush through it. I took my time, because this was the part no one saw. This was the part that turned long hours into something measurable, something undeniable. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the shop again, the lights reflecting softly off the polished surfaces, everything organized, everything intentional. And then my phone buzzed. It was a message from my sister. She wrote, "Hey, can you help me with something business related?" I stared at the screen for a moment, not surprised, not upset, just aware of the shift that had already happened without them noticing. I did not reply right away. Instead, I closed the laptop, stood up, and turned off the lights one by one, just like the night before, but this time I understood something more clearly than ever. They had been measuring me by a title they did not respect, while I had been building something they could not yet understand, and now slowly, quietly, that difference was starting to show. The next day, I replied to my sister message with one simple sentence, "Tell me what you need." She responded almost immediately, like she had been waiting. She said she was working on a property deal and needed advice on managing cash flow for a small operation, something about timing and overhead, something she had never asked me about before. I read the message twice, not because it was complicated, but because of what it meant. For years, she had talked about numbers and investments like they were things I could not understand, and now she was asking me how to handle money. I called her instead of texting back. When she answered, her voice sounded different, softer, more careful. She explained the situation quickly, using terms she had always used with her colleagues, not with me. I listened without interrupting, the way I listened to customers who needed to be heard before they could trust me, and when she finished, I asked her a few simple questions. How much are your fixed costs? How long can you operate without income? What is your break-even point? There was a pause on the line, and then she said, "I have not calculated it that way." Before I could hear it in her voice, she was thinking differently now. I walked slowly through my shop as we talked, looking at each station, each detail that had once been just survival and was now structure. I told her what I had learned, not from books, but from years of counting every dollar, making sure rent was paid before anything else, making sure payroll was never late, making sure growth never moved faster than stability. I explained how I tracked weekly income, not just monthly, how I adjusted prices based on demand, how I planned for slow seasons by saving during busy months. She did not interrupt this time. When I finished, she said, "I did not know you ran things like that." I smiled even though she could not see me, and said, "There is a lot you did not know." After we hung up, I stood by the front window watching people walk past. Some glanced inside, some kept going just like before, but I felt something shift. Again, not in my business, but in how I was being seen. Later that week, my brother called. He asked if I could help his daughter find a part-time job. He said maybe she could learn something practical for the summer. I knew what he meant without him saying it directly. He meant my shop. I told him she could come in for a few hours a day, learn how we clean, how we organize, how we treat customers, not just how we do nails. He agreed quickly, too quickly, like he had already decided before calling me. And when I ended the call, I sat down for a moment, letting it all settle. For years, they had separated my work from their idea of success, and now slowly they were bringing their questions, their problems, their children into the same space they once avoided. I did not feel angry. I did not feel the need to remind them of the past. I just continued what I had always done. I showed up, I worked, I kept things steady, because I knew something they were only beginning to understand. Respect does not come from what you say you do, it comes from what you build and how long it stands. And mine had been standing quietly for a long time. My niece started the following Monday. She arrived 10 minutes early, standing outside the shop looking through the glass, like she was unsure if she belonged there. I unlocked the door and greeted her the same way I greeted every new person, calm and simple. I showed her where to put her bag, where to wash her hands, how to tie her hair back properly, and then I handed her a clean towel and said, "We start with the basics." She nodded quickly, her movements careful, like she did not want to make a mistake. I watched her for a moment before turning back to my work. The shop was already filling up, customers sitting in the waiting area, flipping through their phones, some talking quietly, others just resting in the comfort of routine, and I could feel her eyes on everything, the sounds, the smells, the rhythm of the place. This was not the version of my work she had heard about at family dinners. This was something else entirely. By mid-morning, I asked her to help clean the stations. After each client, she wiped the surfaces slowly, at first unsure of the right pressure, the right pattern. I corrected her gently, not with criticism, but with precision. I showed her how to move efficiently, how to notice small details, like leftover dust or fingerprints on the glass. These things mattered more than people realized, and she began to understand that. By lunchtime, she sat with me in the small break area holding her food, but not eating much. She said, "It is busier than I expected." I nodded and said, "It stays like this most days." She looked surprised again and asked how long it took to get here. I paused for a second and said, "Years." Not loudly, not dramatically, just a fact. She nodded slowly, like she was processing something new. In the afternoon, I let her observe more closely. As I worked on a client, I explained each step, why I shaped the nail a certain way, why I chose one product over another, how I paid attention to what the client said and what they did not say. She watched carefully, her expression changing from curiosity to something closer to respect, and at one point she said, "You remember everything about them?" I smiled slightly and said, "That is the job, not just the nails, but the person." When the last customer left and we began closing, she helped clean without being asked, her movements more confident, more intentional, and before she left, she stood by the door for a moment like she wanted to say something, but was not sure how. Finally, she said, "I did not know it was like this." I looked at her and said, "Most people do not." She hesitated again, then said, "My dad always said you just paint nails." I did not respond right away. I picked up a towel, folded it neatly, placed it on the counter, and then I said, "Your dad knows what he has seen, not what I have built." She nodded, her eyes lowered slightly, not out of shame, but out of understanding. And when she walked out that evening, I watched her go the same way I had watched customers leave for years, quietly noticing the difference in how they arrived and how they left, and for the first time I realized the change was no longer just in my business. It was in how the next generation was beginning to see it, not as something small, not as something to hide, but as something real, something earned, and something worth learning. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and different. My niece kept coming back every weekday after her classes, sometimes quiet, sometimes asking questions, but always paying attention. And I could see the change in her, not just in how she worked, but in how she looked at the space around her. She no longer stood at the edge of the room like a visitor. She moved through the shop like she belonged there. One afternoon during a slower hour, she sat across from me and asked, "How did you know this would work?" I did not answer right away. I finished filing the last nail in front of me, wiped the dust away, and then said, "I did not know." She looked confused, so I continued, "I just knew I could not stay where I was." She nodded slowly, and I could tell she was thinking about something deeper than the question she asked. Later that evening, as we were closing, she said, "My dad asked me how it was here." I said, "What did you tell him?" She hesitated, and then said, "I told him it is not what you think. It is more organized, more serious, more demanding than I expected." I nodded and continued cleaning, not because I had nothing to say, but because that was enough. The next day, my brother walked into the shop for the first time. He stood near the entrance, looking around like he was trying to understand the place without asking questions. I walked over, greeted him calmly, and asked if he needed anything. He said he was just stopping by to see how things were going. His eyes moved from the chairs to the front desk to the schedule board, filled with names and times written neatly in order. He said, "You are busy?" I said, "Yes." He nodded slowly, like he was adjusting his expectations. He stayed for a few minutes, watching quietly as I worked on a client. I explained nothing. I just did what I always did: careful, precise, consistent. When I finished, he said, "I did not realize how detailed this is." I looked at him and said, "Most people do not." He gave a small smile, not defensive, not dismissive, just different. And before he left, he said, "If she wants to keep coming here, I think it is good for her." I nodded and said, "She is learning well." After he walked out, I returned to my station without thinking too much about the moment, but I felt it. The shift was no longer subtle. It was visible in how they spoke, how they asked, how they observed. They were beginning to see not just the work, but the system behind it, the discipline, the structure, the responsibility that came with running something on your own. And that week, as I reviewed my numbers again, I noticed something else. Revenue had increased, not dramatically, but steadily, the kind of growth that came from consistency, not luck. I updated my projections, adjusted my supply orders, and made notes for the next quarter. This was the part that built everything quietly behind the scenes. And as I closed my laptop, I realized something clearly. They had spent years defining my work by a single word, while I had spent those same years building something that could not be reduced to a label. And now, piece by piece, they were starting to see it, not because I told them, but because it was impossible to ignore. The following week, something unexpected happened. One of our regular customers, a woman named Karen, who had been coming to me for almost 8 years, sat down in my chair and said, "I think you should raise your prices." I paused for a second, not because I had not thought about it before, but because hearing it from someone else made it different. I asked her why. She said, "Because this place is always full and you never rush. You remember everything about everyone, and that is rare." I nodded slightly and continued shaping her nails carefully, the same way I always did, but her words stayed with me the rest of the day. After closing, I sat at the front desk again, opened my laptop, and reviewed my numbers, not just the totals, but the patterns, the booking times, the peak hours, the cancellations, the waiting list. Everything was there, clear and consistent. I realized that demand had been exceeding capacity for months. I had just been too focused on stability to adjust for growth. I updated my pricing structure carefully, not too high, not too sudden, just enough to reflect the value that had already been there. And the next morning, when I printed the new price list, I felt something shift again, not fear, not hesitation, just certainty. Throughout the day, customers noticed. Some asked questions, some simply nodded and said, "It makes sense." No one left, no one argued. In fact, the schedule remained full, just like before, if not more so. By the end of the week, I saw the impact clearly. Revenue had increased, but more importantly, the pace of the work had improved. Fewer rushed moments, more control, more intention. And that was what I had always been building, not just income, but balance. Later that week, my sister called again, her tone more direct this time. She said, "I have been thinking about what you said about cash flow and structure, and I think I need to adjust how I manage my deals." I listened quietly as she explained her situation. She asked if I could look over some of her numbers. I agreed, and when she sent them over that evening, I reviewed them the same way I reviewed my own, carefully, methodically, without judgment. I pointed out where her expenses were too high, where her timelines were too optimistic, where she was relying on projections instead of actual data. She did not argue, she did not dismiss anything I said, she just listened. And when we finished, she said, "I did not expect to learn this from you." I smiled slightly and said, "I did not expect to teach it either." After the call ended, I sat there for a moment thinking about how far things had come, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady shift. They were no longer just seeing what I did, they were starting to understand how I thought, how I built, how I managed, and that was something they could not ignore anymore. The next day, my niece arrived earlier than usual. She had brought a notebook. She said, "I want to start writing things down the way you do." I nodded and handed her a pen, and as she sat there taking notes while I worked, I realized something important. This was no longer just about proving anything to anyone. It was about passing something on, something real, something earned, something that did not need a different title to be respected because its value was already clear in the way it worked, in the way it lasted, and in the way it continued to grow without needing permission from anyone. The following month, everything moved faster, but felt more controlled than ever. The schedule was booked 3 weeks out, and for the first time, I had to turn away walk-in customers, not because I wanted to, but because there was simply no space left. I started a waiting list, something I had never done before, and I kept it organized the same way I kept everything else: names, times, preferences, notes about each person. So when a spot opened, I knew exactly who to call and what they needed. My niece watched all of this closely. She was no longer just cleaning or observing. She was beginning to anticipate what needed to be done before I said anything. She refilled supplies without being asked. She greeted customers with confidence. She remembered small details, and I could see the same pattern I had followed years ago beginning to form in her, not because I told her to, but because she was paying attention. One afternoon, a local business owner came in for an appointment. She introduced herself and said she owned a boutique 2 doors down. She had been watching my shop for months. She said, "I see people waiting outside your door every day, and I see how you run things." She paused, and then said, "Have you ever thought about expanding?" I did not answer immediately. I finished the service, carefully wiped the station clean, and then said, "I have thought about it." She smiled and said, "There is a space opening next to my store. You should take a look at it." After she left, I stood there for a moment, considering the idea not as a dream, but as a decision. Expansion meant more responsibility, more staff, more risk, but it also meant growth, the kind that had to be managed carefully, not rushed. That evening, I walked over to the empty space. It was larger than my current shop, the windows wide, the layout open. I stood in the middle of it, imagining the stations, the flow, the structure. I would need to maintain the same level of quality, the same attention to detail, the same consistency that had built everything so far. When I returned to my shop, I sat down with my notebook and began outlining what it would take, not emotionally, but practically: rent, costs, staffing, training, supply chain, timelines. Every detail written down clearly. This was not something I would decide quickly. The next day, my sister came by in person for the first time. She looked around the shop, slowly taking everything in: the customers, the movement, the organization. She did not speak at first. She just observed, and then she said, "This is different than what I thought." I nodded and continued working. She asked if we could talk after closing, and when we sat down, she said, "I have been telling people you own a business now." I looked at her and said, "I always did." She paused, then nodded slightly, not defensive, not dismissive, just acknowledging something she had not said before, and in that moment I realized the change was complete, not because they suddenly understood everything, but because they could no longer reduce it to something small anymore. It had grown beyond that, beyond their expectations, beyond their definitions. And as I closed the shop that night, I knew the next step was not about proving anything. It was about continuing to build something that spoke for itself, quietly, steadily, and without needing permission from anyone. The decision did not happen in one moment. It happened over a series of quiet confirmations, numbers that stayed consistent, customers who kept returning, a team that had grown stronger without losing its rhythm. And one evening, after closing, I sat at the front desk with my notebook open, looking at the plan I had been building, line by line, cost by cost, timeline by timeline, and I realized there was nothing left to question. I had already done the hardest part. One had already built something that worked. The next step was simply to extend it carefully without breaking what made it strong. I signed the lease 2 weeks later, not with excitement, not with fear, but with the same calm certainty that had carried me through everything else. The construction process was steady. I did not rush it. I chose every detail the same way I always had, with intention. The layout mirrored what I knew worked: the spacing, the lighting, the flow between stations. Nothing was left to chance. My niece was there through all of it, measuring spaces, organizing supplies, asking questions, writing everything down, and I could see her confidence growing, not because she was told to believe in it, but because she was part of building it. The second location opened on a quiet Monday morning. No grand announcement, no loud celebration, just the doors open and the lights on. The first few customers walked in, curious, then satisfied, then returning, and within weeks the schedule began to fill, just like the first shop had years ago, but faster this time, because the foundation was already there. I moved between both locations daily, checking details, talking to staff, adjusting systems, making sure everything stayed consistent. Nothing was allowed to drift, because consistency was the reason everything worked. Months passed, and one evening my family gathered again, this Time at my sister's house, the conversation moved the way it always had, topics shifting from work to investments to plans for the future. But this time something was different. When someone asked what I did, there was no hesitation, no adjustment, no softer version. My sister said she owns 2 nail salons. They are always fully booked, and my brother added she runs them better than most businesses. I know. I sat there quietly, not correcting, not adding anything, because there was nothing left to explain. The conversation continued, but I noticed something in the way they spoke, not just about me, but about work in general. Less judgment, more awareness, less assumption, more respect. Later that night, as I drove home, I passed both of my shops, the lights still on inside, the reflections steady against the glass, and I slowed down for a moment, not to admire it, but to acknowledge it. The same hands they once reduced to a single word had built something that now stood on its own, not because it needed approval, but because it worked, because it lasted, because it grew. And I realized something clearly: respect does not arrive all at once. It builds slowly, the same way everything else does, through consistency, through discipline, through time, and by the time others see it, it has already been there for a long time, waiting to be recognized.